Hi, welcome to my recipe writing workshop for interns. My name is Kim Beavers, and I am the co-author of the Best Body Cookbook and Menu Plan, and I co-wrote that with Sohaila Digsby as part of her wellness program that she runs here locally and nationwide. I am also the producer and co-host of the Eating Well with Kim segments that air locally on the CBS affiliate station. And I've been actually doing that particular job for about 13 years, and that's where I began learning how to develop and test recipes. So in this presentation or workshop, I'm going to share with you a lot of information that I've learned over the years to help you do a little better in your recipe writing, should that be something that interests you, but also it is meant to help you during this rotation with me as well. And I do want to help you learn how to get your ideas down on paper in a way that makes sense and promotes healthy, delicious recipes, because a good recipe really does reflect your brand, your profession, and also your philosophy. So it is important to have this information. Basically, I do think you are in the flavor business if you're writing a recipe. The importance of flavor cannot be understated, and I know as a dietitian in the very early stages of my career, I would go into a hospital room and immediately people would think I was going to tell them to get rid of anything that they enjoyed eating. And so I have spent my recipe writing years trying to dispel that myth. Of course, it's a good idea to have an idea of what a recipe is, and it's really not that confusing. It's pretty self-explanatory. It's what you think it is. It's basically a formula or written set of instructions for preparing food. Now, the importance of writing a good recipe cannot be overstated. So when you think about, especially in today's world, people do not cook. One, people don't really know how to cook anymore. That is a skill that we've kind of lost along the way. And also it does take an investment in time and money. And so it's very difficult for people to invest time and money and then have a recipe fail. So it is important to make sure that your recipes work and that they are flavorful, because success always yields additional success. And when you think about being a dietitian, we want our clients to be successful. We want them to eat healthy and eat well. And so if we teach someone how to place nutritious or flavorful foods on their table, then they're going to do it over and over. So I like to think of it as nutrition follows flavor. If we give someone some flavorful foods, they're going to repeat that, right? Because it was delicious. Also, recipes in a cookbook or blog, for example, if they work, then the cookbook will get purchased, and then that person will tell the next person, and they might purchase the cookbook. Or from a blog standpoint, if you know every time I make this person's recipes, they work out well, that blog is going to get followed. So sales also follow flavor. And I think that's important because nutrition is a business. We don't look at it maybe initially as I want to sell things, but we do need to sell healthy eating, right? That's part of our job. And then trust begets trust. So your clients and your followers are going to learn to trust your recipes, and therefore they're going to develop a relationship with you and your recipes. So again, I just can't overstate that a good recipe is important. So the majority of this workshop really is to discuss how to write recipes. And I will tell you that it takes a little bit of time. It's just like anything else. The more you do it, the more you practice it, the better you're going to be. Definitely when I look back 13 years ago at some of my early recipes, they are not the same kind of recipes that I write now. I have learned a lot over the years. And when I go back and pull from my old recipes, I definitely update them. The first stage, or the first step in recipe writing, really is recipe development. So that is what's done by the author or the person hired by the author to create the recipe. Sometimes cookbook authors will hire ghost writers to write recipes. Obviously, it's kind of what we're doing, actually. I was going to say it's not what we're doing in this rotation, but it actually could be, because you're going to write or develop a recipe for me. So you're my ghost writer. You can think of it like that. But basically, this is the first step in the recipe writing process, is to develop the recipe. Now, obviously, you're going to find inspiration for recipe development from many, many sources. Obviously, magazines, restaurants, travel, even supermarkets are really good sources of inspiration. And you might find inspiration from patients. My patients really need high protein breakfasts, or I have a patient who's an athlete and I need a high protein, high carb snack that's healthy. So those might be other sources of inspiration. So I think it's important to kind of allow for a little bit of time for inspiration to occur. I do write down things in my iPhone in my notes section because I can't remember things, and I could be sitting in car line waiting to pick up my kids and an idea will come to me. And so I need to put it somewhere because I won't remember it. And then I actually do have a physical notebook that I keep all my Eating Well with Kim ideas in so that I could pull from those as well. This particular picture is an example of a recipe I developed from a trip to Puerto Rico, and it was based off of the Media Noche sandwich. So it was a sandwich that had ham, roasted pork, pickles, cheese, and some like a mustardy vinegary dressing on it, and it was delicious, but it was everything we had in Puerto Rico was very heavy, and it was like meat and bread everywhere you looked. And so by the time I got home, I was like, oh my gosh, I just want a salad. And that's where that idea came from. So I had toasted breadcrumbs, was kind of representing the sandwich portion of that. And then I had ham and roasted pork, delicious pickles. And then I made some kind of honey mustard dressing. And then I just sliced up a little bit of cheese, threw in some tomatoes for color. And actually, this was one of my favorite recipes. I believe it was last year we made this recipe up. And the people at the station loved it. So it was a repeat. Because they loved it so much. So again, inspirations definitely can come from anywhere. Now, recipe development is different than recipe testing. So the first step is recipe development. The second step is recipe testing. And that's where you test a fully developed recipe. And that is usually done by someone totally different than the author of the recipe or the person who developed the recipe. So for example, when Sohaila and I co-wrote the Best Body Cookbook and Menu Plan, I had developed a lot of the recipes ahead of time because we did use some of my Eating Well with Kim recipes, but I retested them and then we sent them out to be tested by other people once we had typed them up and they looked the way we wanted them to look, and I made any necessary changes. So I took those fully developed recipes and sent them to my mother-in-law, my sister. Sohaila sent them out to her friends. I had a couple friends testing them for me as well because I wanted to see if they worked well in someone else's kitchen. And so that's generally what happens when you are testing recipes or developing recipes and then testing recipes for an actual cookbook. Your testers then give you feedback. So I had a form that I gave my testers, and they gave me feedback like the flavor was really good, I didn't need to cook it for this long, or there wasn't enough salad dressing for all 4 salads, or any kind of feedback that you need. And there are actual professional recipe testers out in the world today. And this is what they do for a living. Now, and that is more specific to writing a book. Okay, so you can pretty much guess or assume that cookbooks have been tested. Those recipes have been thoroughly tested. Whereas, and magazines as well. Whereas blogs, maybe not. It's hard to tell if people test their blogging recipes, as stringently as they might test a cookbook recipe. It's a lot easier to change your blog than it is to go in and change a book once it's been printed, right? So it's really important to get that right. Plus, again, you want your recipes to be successful, and you want people to share the book and buy the book and talk about the book. And that's also where you might hear things like the Pinterest fail, right? That's a pretty famous term. So Pinterest recipes, probably not tested as stringently or at all, as well as a cookbook. And that's okay, but it's just important to know. And also, you may not want to contribute to the world of Pinterest fails, right? Of course, you can contribute to Pinterest, but make sure your recipes work. And again, you'll get followed a little bit more closely that way. For Eating Well with Kim, for this rotation, we don't have the resources or the time for you to develop a recipe and then send it out for someone else to test. So I really do combine those tasks in this particular rotation. So you are going to develop the recipe and you're going to cook it one time, and that's going to count for your testing. But I do want you to understand that in the real world, those are two totally separate steps in the recipe writing process. I do give you a form. I have combined the recipe development form with the testing form, and you can certainly use the form and you can handwrite it all, or you can just type it up in the computer or on a Word document, just making sure all the elements of the form are included. And then you could just simply email it to me. But again, just important to know that recipe development and testing are actually two different things. Okay, so when you're writing a recipe, there's something called your recipe writing voice. And that is really just how you describe a process, just like you would to your friend, on a Friday afternoon. You're going to explain to them how you're going to cook this recipe and what the steps are. So you could tape yourself explaining a recipe or a procedure, and that might give you an idea of what your recipe writing voice is. But really, it's just some of the wording that you choose and how you describe it. So maybe you say, add vegetables to the pan, or maybe you say, place vegetables in the pan, or maybe you say, saute veggies, or maybe you say, saute vegetables, or maybe you say, stir veggies occasionally instead of sauteing. So it's just kind of developing your own flow and your own voice. And for the most part, that's going to stay fairly consistent among your recipes, and that's part of what makes a recipe yours. You're adding your words and your voice to that recipe. Now, recipe style is also something that is kind of uniquely yours, but it is a little bit more related to format of a recipe. So the title and the head note, like, do your recipes have head notes? So head notes are really just as those descriptive little paragraphs or sentences right below the title. Another example of a recipe style is if there are pre-cooking or preparation steps listed in the recipe. For example, as it says here on the slide, 2 large eggs at room temperature. That's kind of like a pre-preparation step, if you will. I prefer that in my recipes. I like people to have an idea of what's expected for each particular ingredient as they're looking at the ingredient list, instead of having to search in the paragraphs below for this information. Also, a style choice would be if you're going to abbreviate or if you're going to spell everything out. Again, for Eating Well with Kim, we spell everything out. We're not really limited on space. In some cookbooks or handouts and things, you might be limited in space, and so it might be more appropriate to abbreviate. But I do like to spell everything out for what I do, because I feel like it's just more clear. It's more clear for people. There's less chance of misunderstanding something. So the Eating Well with Kim recipes have a different style than the style we used in the Best Body Cookbook and Menu Plan. Even though we used a lot of the same recipes, they're very similar styles, but they're slightly different. Another example that's completely different is The Joy of Cooking. It is written in an action method where it talks about what you're supposed to do with a recipe with an ingredient as it lists the ingredient, versus the traditional recipe style where recipes will list the ingredients and then the procedure. And there's no right or wrong recipe style. It's different, again, for each publication, and it's also different among different people, have different preferences. So again, in this particular rotation, it's best if you use the Eating Well with Kim style of recipe writing, and of course I'm going to provide you examples in an email, and I probably have already done that. This is just an example of the exact same recipe written in the cookbook recipe style versus Eating Well with Kim's recipe style. And again, they're very similar. They both have head notes. I think very highly of head notes because I think that sort of helps sell the recipe to the reader, and people generally like that. In terms of the cookbook, you can see where the paragraphs are numbered, the steps are numbered, whereas with Eating Well with Kim, I use just paragraphs. That's a style choice. The way the recipe is written is a style choice based on how the editor wanted to lay out the cookbook. Whereas mine is just simply an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper for Eating Well with Kim. So again, the publication sometimes dictates the style as well. So copyright is always a big deal when you're talking about creating new recipes or writing your own recipes. So there are some basic facts that I have pulled together over the years. And one is that copyright protection does not extend to the ingredient list. So a list of ingredients or foods is not copyrighted. What is potentially copyrighted is the written expression of the formula, aka the paragraph below that explains the procedure of how to put the recipe ingredients together. So when in doubt, always give credit. And mainly because it's ethical and right. It actually honors me as an author if somebody is going to take inspiration from my recipe. And most people are going to be happy to either share their recipe or be excited that you have gotten inspiration from their recipe. Some people are going to are not going to be that way, but for the most part, authors want their recipes to be shared, and it's exciting to have someone take notice of your work. But again, you want to be credited if the credit belongs to you. Lots of people have heard that if you change 3 ingredients, then you've made the recipe your own, and that is not necessarily true. In fact, it's completely false. We've already said ingredients can't be copyrighted, but that expression of how the recipe ingredients are put together is what is copyrighted. And so when an author writes in his or her voice, it's their voice, it's not your voice. So again, in order to avoid plagiarism, you write your recipe in your voice. Certainly you can be inspired by someone else, but you want to write your own recipe using your own voice and your own style. And I have provided you with a recipe writing handout that helps you and guides you along that way in terms of how to avoid copyright infringement. This is an example of where I gave credit. I don't know Mark Bittman, but I have 2 of his cookbooks, so I couldn't really ask him if I could give him credit for his recipe. And this is not his recipe, it's my recipe, but I got this procedure or the method for cooking the recipe from his cookbook. So it is right for me to say that. And so I just come out and say that. And it doesn't take anything away from me that I've said, hey, this cooking method belongs to Mark Bittman. I discovered it in his cookbook. Really, it kind of gives me credit and authenticity that, hey, this is awesome and it works really well and I got it here. So I feel like it just kind of gives me an element of professionalism to do that versus taking something away from me. And this is just another example of giving credit to someone. I actually have gotten to know Toby Amador over social media. We've connected on Facebook. I've seen her at a conference actually. And so I added ricotta cheese to one of the desserts that Sohail and I put in her cookbook. And I just felt like this was enough similar to her recipe that I had used in the past that I wanted to give her credit for that. When you have that weird feeling inside, like, should I give her credit? Should I not give her credit? Like, always err on the side of giving someone credit. So I told Toby, since I already had a connection with her, I said, hey, I took the method that you used for your Italian strawberry cheesecake dessert. I used that method of adding ricotta cheese, developed another recipe. We're going to put it in a cookbook. I'm going to mention you as a source of recipe inspiration, and then I gave her the cookbook. I sent her a cookbook. And so since then, we've remained in contact and have supported one another. So giving credit where credit is due never hurts. If you're excited by copyright information and want more of this information, I've given you 2 resources here. The first one is a blog post, and that one is actually the most informative of the 2 sources. It is written by an attorney and an author. So anyway, lots of good information in there should you want to read up on that a little bit more. So now a recipe's been developed, and now we're going to write it down. So this is really just a basic recipe writing format, and this is kind of how this is what I use for Eating Well with Kim recipes. Obviously, you need a title. You do want it to be somewhat informative about the actual recipe versus, like this example here says picnic salad. Is that a green salad? Is it chicken salad? What kind of salad is it? That's not real descriptive. So It is important that your recipe does describe, or your title does describe what the recipe is. And then including a head note. I absolutely love head notes. To me, again, that's what sells the recipe. You can tell the cook how to envision the dish, how to use the recipe, what the recipe goes well with, why it's a special recipe, why it's nutritious, how it fills a need or solves a problem for them, or just simply that is delicious. And then, of course, for the ingredient list, you're going to list things in the order of use. You're going to avoid abbreviations since space is not an issue for us. That's how we do it at Eating Well with Kim. You're going to offer alternatives whenever possible. Fresh or dry herbs would be an example where you could offer an alternative. You can also give some short preparation instructions like bell peppers diced. I think that's important to include. That helps the reader know ahead of time. I've got some bell peppers already diced in my freezer. I don't have to go buy a bell pepper, right? But if we've hidden that dice the bell pepper in the paragraphs underneath, then they haven't read that ahead of time, and then they've had to go get a bell pepper perhaps. So anyway, I like to give a little bit of pre-information ahead of time, pre-cooking information. And then for our recipes, we are going to avoid brands unless it's super important to the recipe and or we're being sponsored by somebody, which we're not. So I usually leave the brands out of it. For instructions or the preparation instructions, you do want to make sure that you're focused on clarity, that it makes sense, that we've explained everything we need to explain. When you read through it on your own after you've written it, do you notice that the cook would need additional information about a technique or the equipment that you've said they should use? I remember when I first started doing recipes or reading cookbooks, I kept seeing the word Dutch oven, and I had no idea what a Dutch oven was. It's basically a big pot. So sometimes I still have to be careful and not use the word Dutch oven, not because it's bad to use it, but because, again, I feel like there are people who don't know what that is. And so I want to make things clear for people. And then, of course, divide your steps logically. Number them or separate them by paragraphs, and that's, again, what we do at Eating Well with Kim. We use paragraphs. I always put a yield and a serving size, and I do nutritionally analyze all of my recipes. And again, I'll send you those examples. I like to keep everything in the same format. So we'll keep that consistent through our recipe writing. Here's a couple of the books that I use as resources. A lot of the information that I got out of this or for this webinar or workshop come from these books. So Food Lover's Companion is really great. It just kind of really tells you anything you want to know about a food ingredient. Recipe Writer's Handbook, I spent a lot of time on that when I first started my job with Eating Well with Kim. And I revisited that when I co-wrote the cookbook with Sohaila. And the Flavor Bible is really a neat resource. It lists different ingredients. So let's say I want to look up peanuts. It's going to tell me all the different spices that go with peanuts. So it just has tons of ingredients listed in alphabetical order and all the things that go with it. So sometimes if I'm stuck and I can't think of how do I want to season this, I can look in my Flavor Bible and get some ideas that way. Recipes into Type is another book that talks about how to write recipes. I don't actually have that one, but it is a resource that's been suggested to me multiple times, so I wanted to include it in this. In terms of being successful with writing recipes, take good notes when you're testing your recipe. Because a lot of times I'll scribble something thinking I'll remember it. Like I'll scribble half of a sentence and I'm like, what was I trying to say here? So make sure you take good notes. Ask for help with testing, like if you're actually going to be testing recipes for a cookbook, or make sure your recipe works if you're not sending it out for testing. Make sure to give credit where credit's due. Of course, have some fun. Food is supposed to be fun and delicious. And remember that your recipes are basically your work and they represent you, and you want to share them with your clients or your patients, and you want your patients and clients to be successful. In terms of our rotation, obviously let me know if you have any questions. The more you ask and communicate with me, the more you're going to learn and get out of this rotation. I hope that you do enjoy this creative process. It's likely that your recipe is going to be on TV, so give it your best go, and as always, to your delicious health.